High on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, far above the last permanent camps and beyond the reach of helicopters, there is a narrow platform carved into wind-scoured snow and ice. At approximately 8,400 meters above sea level, this place is known among climbers as the balcony. It is not a summit, nor is it a technical landmark in the traditional sense. There are no flags planted there, no permanent markers or structures that distinguish it from the endless terrain surrounding it. Yet, in the logic of high-altitude climbing, the balcony represents something far more consequential than elevation alone. It is the last realistic point on the mountain where turning around remains physically achievable without immediate assistance. Beyond this ledge, the nature of the ascent changes, and so does the climber attempting it. By the time individuals reach this altitude, they have already spent hours moving through terrain that offers no protection from wind or cold. The slope leading up from the south col steepens gradually, forcing progress into a rhythm defined by breath and muscle fatigue. Oxygen systems, when functioning correctly, allow climbers to maintain minimal efficiency. But even with supplemental support, the human body at this height operates in a fragile state. The atmosphere contains less than a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Blood oxygen saturation declines with each step, impairing coordination, slowing reflexes, and altering cognitive processing in subtle but measurable ways. The approach to the balcony typically begins in darkness. Summit attempts are launched late in the evening from Camp the Fours, which sits at approximately 7,900 meters on a plateau known as the South Col. Departures are staggered throughout the night, headlamps forming a slow-moving chain of light against the slope. The climb upward is not steep enough to require constant technical maneuvers, yet it demands sustained effort. Each step must be placed deliberately. Each breath must be regulated. Climbers advance in silence, conserving energy for terrain that remains unseen above. As altitude increases, the environment becomes progressively less forgiving. Wind currents strengthen unpredictably, shifting across exposed ridges without warning. Temperatures fall well below freezing, and any exposed skin begins to lose sensation within minutes. Frost accumulates along the edges of masks and goggles. Moisture from breath condenses and freezes instantly. Movement generates heat only temporarily. When climbers pause, even briefly, the cold begins to penetrate insulated layers, stiffening joints and reducing dexterity. Despite these conditions, upward momentum continues. The psychological objective of reaching the summit exerts a measurable influence over perception. Decisions that might appear cautious at lower altitude are reinterpreted as hesitation. Minor equipment issues are postponed rather than addressed. Fatigue is dismissed as temporary. The mountain above remains invisible in darkness, its upper slopes concealed beyond the reach of artificial light. After several hours of steady progress, the slope begins to flatten. The wind, momentarily diverted by subtle terrain features, eases slightly. Climbers emerge onto a small, relatively level area, often no larger than a few meters across. Here they pause to adjust oxygen regulators, exchange empty cylinders for full ones, or simply recover enough strength to continue upward. This is the balcony. In daylight, the platform offers a view across the Himalayan range that extends for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Peaks rise through the cloud layer like isolated islands, their shadows stretching across distant glaciers. But summit attempts rarely allow for extended observation. Time spent stationary at this altitude increases risk exponentially. The body cools rapidly. Cognitive clarity deteriorates further. Climbers remain aware that each minute lost here must be recovered during descent. Yet the balcony serves another purpose, one less immediately visible. It marks a transition between two distinct physiological states. Below this point, acclimatization and supplemental oxygen can still compensate partially for reduced atmospheric pressure. Above it, compensation becomes increasingly unreliable. Blood flow to extremities diminishes. Muscles operate at reduced efficiency. Decision-making processes, particularly those involving risk assessment, are affected in ways that may not be recognized by the individual experiencing them. Studies conducted on climbers at extreme altitude indicate that hypoxia alters judgment without producing consistent subjective awareness. Individuals may feel capable of continuing even as objective performance declines. Reaction times lengthen. Memory retrieval becomes inconsistent. Tasks requiring coordination demand greater concentration. These changes do not occur abruptly. Instead, they accumulate gradually, often interpreted as fatigue rather than impairment. From the balcony, the route continues along the southeast ridge toward the south summit. The terrain narrows, exposure increases. Fixed ropes guide movement across sections where a misstep would result in immediate descent into steep couloirs below. At this stage, climbers are typically already experiencing caloric deficits, dehydration, and sleep deprivation accumulated over previous days. Appetite often disappears entirely at high altitude, reducing energy intake even as physical demand intensifies. Despite mounting physiological strain, the summit remains within reach, a fact that influences behavior profoundly. The distance separating the balcony from the highest point on Earth is measurable not only in meters but in perceived effort. Having advanced this far, retreat begins to feel counterintuitive. Turning around implies relinquishing progress achieved at considerable cost. Climbers may reason that conditions above will improve, or that remaining distance can be covered before environmental factors deteriorate further. In practice, however, the opposite frequently occurs. Weather patterns at extreme altitude can shift rapidly. Wind speeds increase. Cloud cover reduces visibility. Snow accumulation obscures established tracks. Even minor delays encountered here, a malfunctioning regulator, a congested section of rope, a brief navigational error, can compound over time, affecting the margin available for safe descent. The balcony remains behind them now, the last point where recovery from fatigue might still permit retreat without immediate external assistance. Above, the ridge continues toward terrain where turnaround decisions become less frequent, not because climbers lack awareness of risk, but because the cognitive framework used to evaluate that risk has already begun to change. It is at this altitude that summit fever often manifests most strongly. The term describes a psychological state in which the objective of reaching the top overrides competing considerations. Warning signs, declining weather, equipment failure, physical exhaustion, are reinterpreted in light of proximity to success. The summit is close. Effort invested thus far must be justified. Retreat becomes framed not as preservation, but as loss. From below, observers tracking summit teams through radio communication or visual confirmation may note delayed turnaround times. Climbers expected to descend after reaching a predetermined altitude continue upward instead. Plans established at base camp or during earlier stages of the expedition lose authority when confronted with immediate opportunity. Above the balcony, oxygen consumption increases as exertion intensifies. Cylinders emptied sooner than anticipated may leave individuals reliant on reduced flow rates. Mask seals degrade under frost accumulation. Regulators freeze intermittently. Each adjustment requires removing gloves, an action that risks frostbite within seconds at ambient temperatures, often approaching -30 degrees Celsius. The slope steepens once more approaching the south summit. Climbers progress individually or in small groups, separated by distance that reflects varying pace and endurance. Communication becomes minimal. Speech requires oxygen they cannot spare. Signals are exchanged through gesture rather than words. Far below, the south col remains obscured by terrain. Camp IV cannot be seen from this angle. The balcony, though only recently departed, has already vanished from view. The route ahead offers no alternative descent lines. Movement is constrained to a single path, defined by fixed rope and previous tracks in snow. In this environment, continuation becomes the default. Not because it is safer, but because turning around demands a level of physical and cognitive capacity that may no longer be present. And beyond this point, the mountain will begin to collect its cost, not on the way up, but on the way back down. Beyond the south summit, the character of the climb changes once again. The slope narrows into a ridge where movement becomes both more deliberate and more exposed. To one side, the Kangshung face drops thousands of meters toward Tibet. To the other, the southwest face falls away into Nepal. There is no margin here for lateral correction. Every step must remain aligned with the fixed rope that threads its way along the crest. At this altitude, even minor imbalances can propagate into falls that no equipment can fully arrest. The terrain between the south summit and the true summit is not extensive in horizontal distance. In optimal conditions, the traverse may require less than an hour. Yet time on Everest is rarely governed by terrain alone. Progress depends on wind velocity, visibility, and the condition of those attempting it. When multiple teams converge on the same section of ridge, movement slows further. Climbers queue behind one another at narrow points. waiting for an opportunity to advance along rope segments that cannot safely support simultaneous passage. Each pause introduces new risk. Standing still at over 8,700 meters reduces heat generation almost immediately. Muscles cool, coordination declines. Oxygen consumption continues even without forward motion. Regulators are adjusted repeatedly to compensate for increasing effort, accelerating depletion of remaining supply. The summit itself, when it finally appears, does not rise in dramatic isolation. Instead, it emerges gradually, a slight elevation beyond a final incline, marked by a modest corniced dome of snow. Reaching it requires no celebratory ascent, only continuation along terrain already negotiated for hours. For many, arrival produces a response less defined by elation than by relief. The upward phase has ended. The objective has been achieved. Yet this moment marks not completion, but transition. Time spent on the summit must remain brief. Photographs are taken quickly, gloves removed only when necessary. Some kneel momentarily. Others stand in silence, their attention divided between the view and the descent that now awaits them. Oxygen gauges are checked. Remaining pressure is estimated against distance back to Camp Fort. The route downward follows the same line used during ascent. Tracks established earlier may already be softened by wind or drifted beneath fresh snow. In daylight, terrain that appeared uniform in darkness reveals subtle variations in slope angle and surface condition. Features that guided upward progress, ice bulges, rock outcrops, now appear different when approached from above. Initial descent often feels deceptively manageable. Gravity assists forward movement. Steps require less muscular force, but fatigue accumulated during the climb upward has not dissipated. Reaction times remain lengthened. Concentration must be sustained to prevent misplacement of crampon points on hardened surfaces. As altitude decreases toward the south summit, the first signs of systemic exhaustion begin to appear. Minor stumbles become more frequent. Adjustments to rope clips take longer. Climbers may pause unexpectedly, attempting to recalibrate breathing or clear condensation from masks that has frozen along the interior. In some cases, oxygen flow rates are increased to compensate for perceived weakness. This response provides temporary clarity but accelerates consumption of finite reserves. Cylinders nearing depletion are exchanged if spares remain available. Where none exist, climbers must continue with reduced support. Weather, stable during the ascent, may begin to shift. Cloud formations gather along the ridge. Wind speeds increase incrementally, lifting loose crystals of snow into the air. Visibility declines not through darkness, but through diffuse scattering of light that obscures depth perception. Returning to the south summit requires negotiating terrain already traversed in the opposite direction. Fixed lines assist, yet descending while fatigued presence challenges distinct from climbing upward. Balance must be maintained while facing downhill on steep sections. Hands, already numb within insulated gloves, must manipulate carabiners and ascenders with reduced tactile feedback. Below the south summit, the ridge widens slightly. The path toward the balcony slopes downward at an angle that encourages forward momentum. Here, coordination becomes critical. A misjudged step on hard ice can result in uncontrolled sliding toward exposed faces where arresting movement may not be possible. For many climbers, it is during this stage that cognitive impairment becomes evident. Simple tasks, adjusting mask straps, checking regulator valves, require repeated attempts. Conversations, when attempted, are brief and fragmented. Speech is rationed against oxygen availability. The balcony, once the final point of decision during ascent, reappears as a landmark of relative safety. Here, some may pause again to exchange cylinders or restore circulation to extremities that have remained immobile for extended periods. Afternoon weather patterns frequently deteriorate without warning. Wind intensifies along the southeast ridge, funneled through topographic features that accelerate airflow. Snow accumulation increases friction on rope systems, complicating descent. Below the balcony, the slope steepens once more toward the south col. Camp IV remains out of sight until the final approach. Distance, measured in vertical meters, belies the effort required to cover it. Muscular fatigue now competes with declining oxygen supply. Regulators deliver diminished flow as cylinders empty. It is in this region that frostbite often begins to manifest. Prolonged exposure combined with restricted blood flow to extremities results in tissue cooling beyond recoverable limits. Hands used repeatedly to manage rope systems may lose dexterity entirely. Feet immobilized within rigid boots receive insufficient circulation to maintain warmth. Reaching the upper edge of the South Col does not conclude risk. Terrain here remains exposed to wind and drifting snow. Tents erected earlier in the expedition may be partially buried or damaged by gusts that have shifted their anchoring systems. Entry into camp lifts provides limited shelter. Oxygen systems are removed. Masks are cleared of frost. Gloves are exchanged for drier pairs if available. Yet rewarming extremities too rapidly can produce pain severe enough to prevent sleep. Circulation returning to previously constricted tissue generates sensations, described by survivors as burning or stabbing. By morning, decisions must be made regarding descent toward lower camps. Remaining at the South Col increases exposure to environmental hazards, yet movement while exhausted presents its own dangers. Teams often descend in stages, redistributing loads and assisting those whose condition has declined during summit attempts. It is during these subsequent phases that the true cost of the climb becomes evident. Frostbite, initially presenting as numbness or discoloration, progresses as tissue warms. Swelling restricts circulation further. Blisters form beneath damaged skin. Evacuation from extreme altitude is slow. Helicopter retrieval is rarely possible above lower camps. Individuals must descend under their own power or with assistance from others who remain subject to the same environmental constraints. Weeks later, after return to base camp and eventual transport to medical facilities, surgical intervention may become necessary. Tissue that cannot recover must be removed to prevent infection. Hands and feet, essential for future climbing, are often those most affected. The summit, achieved hours earlier, remains unchanged. The balcony, passed during ascent and descent alike, continues to mark the place where retreat was still within reach. And for many who climbed beyond it, the journey back would demand far more than the effort required to reach the top. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us that on mountains like Everest, the summit is never the final challenge, only the beginning of the return. If you enjoy immersive historical expeditions and real stories from the most extreme places on Earth, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the journeys ahead.